So last week we had a poll in the community tab where I asked you guys to vote on the next Tabletop Tavern Tips topic, and you guys very decidedly chose a video on my DMPC and why she worked in my own campaign. Now don't worry, if you guys want the Rogue video and the Fighter video, those are coming. They're just gonna come later down the line. I can see why DMPC won. DMPCs are kind of a big deal on this channel. They appear quite often in our RPG Horror Stories series, and they are always the bad guys, ruining the campaign, spotlight hogging, taking the story away from the players, the DM essentially having their own fantasy about their own characters, all that. So, those DMPCs are obviously bad. They're doing things that ruin the fun for other players. But there are NPC tagalongs, NPC allies, DMPCs that are written into modules or parts of major online campaigns, such as Irina in Curse of Strahd, or Zelda in Brennan's Dimension 20, or Calia Sulfero in my own game, and hundreds, thousands of other examples from other home games and shows. So why do NPCs like the ones I just listed work, and the NPCs in RPG Horror Stories? Well, today, let's talk about it. Let's talk about ways that you can make a DMPC work in your own campaign, an NPC tag-along that can be a part of the party and allow the DM to join in and maybe even balance out combat a little bit if you're having trouble with it. Make the dynamic roleplay more interesting, etc., etc., etc. There are benefits, but at times it can be tricky to pull off. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm not gonna lie, guys, I haven't watched much Dimension 20, and I haven't played through Curse of Strahd all the way through yet. So, I don't really have extensive experience with either Zelda or Irina. So, I decided to bring in my own DMPC. So, without further ado, roll the clip on the backstory behind Calia Sulfero. The girl waited outside the inn, a symbol of happiness, of normalcy, that she hadn't felt in so long, but she wasn't here for the food nor the music. She was certainly starving, but her goal kept her mind off her hunger. She had waited for this moment, this very moment, for so many years. She knew he was in there. The girl had watched him for years, preparing for this moment. Watched his every move, his every habit, monitored his every step. For someone so horrible, the man she sought was really quite predictable. He stepped outside the door, 2 hours past midnight, just as he always had, just as she predicted. The explosion racked the city. The people inside the tavern quickly fled as guards rushed to investigate the scene, but she knew that it was done. She saw his burned and mangled body, sprawled against the cobblestones. She tasted victory. Years of planning, gathering materials, bargaining with arcanists. Everything over in an instant. She didn't know what to do next. As the man died, she saw something. She worried for a moment. Did he have a failsafe? A failsafe even against death itself? But no, he was still dead. But a symbol on his back glowed and then quickly disappeared. And then reappeared on her own very hand. She didn't know what it meant. But Calia Sulfero had the wherewithal to realize that this meant everything was going to change for her. Yet again. Calia had spent so long in the business of revenge that she figured she might as well turn it into her actual business now. She was hardly the best swordsman in the city, but it doesn't really matter who's best. All that matters is who's better, who has the advantage, who has the edge. And the mark upon her hand certainly gave her an edge. Eldritch magic that she didn't really understand, but all that mattered was that it allowed her to win. Calia certainly won tons of enemies, that is. One day, though, she crossed a man who was different. Crawford Cyrillish. He didn't scream or order her death. Instead, when he realized that she had stolen a kill from his men, he smiled. He realized that this girl was so much more than just another street urchin assassin wannabe. She was something special. Calia couldn't figure him out. She had gotten decent at reading people, but He taught her to read and write, to scheme, to plan. He taught her how to live normally, something that she had never really had. She started as Crawford's blade, the bulwark against his enemies. But soon, Calia would become his daughter. Her life certainly improved. She had enough to eat now. She had a roof over her head, money to spend, better clothing, better weapons, more interesting jobs for certain. But life definitely wasn't perfect. She's coped by becoming incredibly distant as a person, only really opening up to Crawford. Calia wouldn't be exactly described as someone with tons of friends. The only real people that she meets are either colleagues or targets. So when her path crossed with the parties in the city of Glade, she really didn't know what to think. The first thing she did to them was lie, a practice that she had been forced to hone over many years. She had lied about herself so many times that, at this point, she barely ever used her real name. But whether the party knew or not, they didn't really care. They accepted her and were kind to her, not like anyone she'd ever met before. Whereas initially she saw them as nothing more than just another job, a part of another gig, she soon saw them truly as her friends. Her first friends in her entire life. The party backed her up and saved her life multiple times. Not only did they help her with the more dangerous work, but the party also helped her to come out of her shell. The life of a hitman doesn't really lend itself to socializing, so she had a lot to learn in that respect. It's not that her life got easier with them around. If anything, it might have gotten harder, going from assassinating rival gang leaders and noblemen to fighting literal dragons. Well, it's a bit of whiplash that she took some time to get used to. But despite the more extreme challenges, she's happy. Or, well, happier, at least. Calia Sulfero is a human fighter rogue multi-class. You got your fighter and rogue video after all, look at that. When writing her, I wanted to stray away from the badass rogue stereotype, the edgelord. That's what I didn't want to do. Can that character work? Absolutely. But a lot of my player characters were familiar with characters in media that fit that niche. So I wanted to make Calia unique. And when I was writing her, I settled on making her awkward and anxious as a character quirk, or a trait. It was a big part of her personality, so I actually think it was a bit more than a quirk. It fit with her character. I mean, she spent a lot of her life undercover, under disguise. She's constantly lying about her identity. She doesn't get to interact with people almost at all. The only person she has a relationship with is her father. Everyone else are targets or colleagues. So she has this really isolated life, meaning that when she gets into a social situation and she has to talk to people, she's incredibly anxious and awkward. And it made her really likable to the party. And that brings us neatly on to our first point. The first reason, and one that I think was made clear by the backstory clip, was that the party wanted her around. It was the party's choice to have Calia join up on their adventures. That is a major reason why DMPCs and RPG horror stories do not work. Let's take a moment to talk about Resnir, a DMPC that appeared in a previous episode of RPG Horror Stories, who was bad. He was really, really bad. Why? Well, for starters, the DM constantly forced him into the party's adventures. He would just spontaneously appear and steal kills in dungeons. He would even chase after them while they were on horseback to give monologues. That is completely crappy. The party clearly do not want Resnir to be part of their adventure, yet the DM keeps trying to force it. If you want to create a compelling DMPC, the first thing you need to do is make sure that the party actually want them around. Now, how do you do that? Well, for starters, you need to test the waters, so to speak. The first thing Calia did was give them a quest. She was a quest giver before she was an ally in combat or anything like that. So the party got an opportunity to roleplay with her right off the bat. And they clearly liked her even through that first roleplay interaction. Even though the party were fairly new to roleplay, everyone at the table had only played D&D for like a few sessions before then. So Calia was really one of the first NPCs that they had extensive roleplay with. And they were very natural with her. I was happy to see that. That's a signal to me that they were comfortable with this character, and it was great to see them come out of their shell as role players, especially with a character I didn't know they would like or not. Quite frankly, you don't know for certain if your party are going to like a character until they're interacting. Test the waters first. Whether you use the NPC as a quest giver or just a random meeting or whatever, just make sure to test if your party like them. Then start to introduce them into the campaign more often. Calia was a quest giver, then I had the party choose where they wanted to go. They could either go to a city in the east or go to a city in the west alongside Calia. They chose to go with Calia, signaling to me that yes, they definitely like this character. Now actually, at that point in the campaign, Calia was not a huge part of it. I didn't plan for her to be anything more than just a quest giver for a couple of quest lines and that's it. But at that point, I decided to make her a bigger part of the campaign. I expanded her backstory, expanded her role. Now that brings us neatly onto our next point. Even though I expanded Calia's role in the campaign, she never, ever stole the spotlight from the players. Well, how did Calia get all this backstory? How was her story introduced to the players? It all depends on how you frame it. See, Calia didn't have extensive monologues or quest lines. The party were investigating Calia's backstory. The party were the ones learning it. Calia wasn't telling it to them. It's all about how you frame it. Instead of Calia going on a long quest line to slay the evil drow who scarred her face horribly, that had already happened. The party instead learned about it in hindsight, through their own scrying and investigation, going through Calia's stuff, etc., which created, number one, interesting roleplay interactions between Calia and the party, but also made sure the party were still in the spotlight. Let's go to another DMPC story that you might have heard, not from me, but from Crit Crab, the Airship Saga. That story is infamous in the community for being really, really bad, and being filled with tons of bad DMPCs. Those DMPCs constantly stole the spotlight away from the players. When players were interacting, DMPCs would come in and hijack the conversation for themselves. Your DMPCs or NPC allies, whatever, should never do that. They can be a part of roleplay, but they should never be the central focus. Of course, there are going to be times where they are the focus of conversation in a way that characters are talking about them, or they're confronting the NPC about their backstory or whatever, but you as the DM should never seek out stealing the spotlight away from players. You should never set out to make sure that this DMPC has X amount of screen time, so to speak, and stealing conversations and roleplay interactions away from players. That is guaranteed to irk your players. Roleplaying is hard enough on some people without the DM, the omnipotent creator of this universe, using a character to steal away their roleplay interactions. Don't do that. Of course, your NPC can, and maybe probably will inevitably be a point of conversation with the party, especially if they're with them for a long period of time. But when Calia was a point of conversation, it was never that I, the DM, forced it. It was always the players. The players were always the one who decided for themselves, we are going to talk about Calia now. We're going to roleplay with her now. We're going to figure out what about this girl's backstory is true and what about it was a lie. It was always their choice. It was never my choice as the DM. Now, one thing that we definitely need to talk about is DMs out there. I know that some people, not many, but enough that I noticed, some people, some DMs, want to play Dungeons & Dragons and think a DMPC is a good way to do it. I saw some people responding to the community post like that, and look, I'm going to be honest with you. That is completely impossible. The DM cannot have the same experience as a player in their own game. You're the DM. You're the omnipotent being running this game. You have knowledge of all the plot twists. You created a lot of the monsters. You're running this game. You just will not have the same experience as the players. And if you try to force yourself into the campaign to have that same experience, it's gonna make it worse. Reframe your ideas. A DMPC is still an NPC, a non-player character. They're just not going to be the same. They can have a character sheet, they can be along with the party, but they are not the equal of the player characters. They are along for the ride. Did Calia in my campaign have cool moments? Yeah, but she never, ever overshadowed the rest of the party. And like I said, whenever she was the center of roleplay, it was always the player characters who decided to make that happen. It was never me as a DM who forced it to happen instead. Now, I don't have a neat transition to this one, but try to seek out feedback from your players when it comes to your NPC character that you have put with the rest of the party. Now, of course, you should be seeking feedback in all aspects of your game. But when it comes to an NPC ally who is a constant presence in the campaign, it's especially important to make sure that they are of quality. They're a constant presence, and if they're bad, then they're going to be a constant bad part of the game, so you don't want that to happen. Make sure to ask your players, hey guys, how are we feeling about X NPC? I made sure to do that with Calia. How are we feeling about her, guys? If they said they're feeling great about her, then awesome, I'm doing my job right. If they said that they didn't like her, then I'd ask them if they want her to depart from the party or what I can do to improve her if they want her to stick around. Calia was part of the campaign for a while. At the very end of the campaign, she was actually romanced by one of the player characters, which was definitely a whole different video that we can talk about later. But yeah, she became a constant presence, meaning that I wanted to make sure the players liked her. Just make sure to constantly ask for feedback. If something serious happens in the campaign, like there's a moment that you're not sure about, just ask your players. It does not hurt. Now, I do have other videos about DMPCs. I've already linked one. I also have another video on NPCs and how you can make them interesting. This does not just apply to NPC allies. This is all NPCs in general. You should definitely check that one out if you want to make your own interesting NPCs. I really hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you guys like Calia. Unfortunately, I do not have her character sheet anymore because the campaign ended a while ago and I have completely lost it. But if you guys are interested, I can remake it for you guys. The commission was done by some artists on Etsy. They are down in the description below. Unfortunately, their commission slots are currently closed, but if they ever open, I definitely recommend a commission. As you can see by the art of Calia, they are amazing. If you guys enjoyed this episode of Tabletop Tavern Tips and want to let me know, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more of my content, then please do subscribe to Crispy's Tavern. And finally, if you want to leave your own tips or thoughts, go down to the comments down below. If you can't think of a comment, leave the comment Sulfero to let me know you made it to the end of the video. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I'll see you all next time. Farewell.